Sociologists, welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about racial formation in the United States by Omi and Winant, specifically the article we read for this week's modules. Our discussion questions for this week are: define race as a social construction, explain racial formation, summarize the origin story described by Omi and Winant, or in other words, how did racial formation start? Explain why it was necessary for Europeans to socially construct race as they did. Describe how race is a social construct. Don't forget to include the evidence Omi and Winant provided for us in the article. Explain why the concept of hypodescent was so significant in shaping our racially subordinate groups, the definitions and embedded meaning of those groups. And how does the effectiveness of racial formation as a process shape the way we perceive race as natural and common sense? So let's get started. The first thing we want to talk about is what is race, and talk a little bit about the origin story of how racial categories became important. So race is inherently a social construction. The social construction of the categories of race has emerged through the shaping and reshaping of racial definitions throughout our history, largely influenced by those in power, the government. And those racial categories are continuously embedded with meaning through both racial projects and the process of racial formation. Race consciousness, like the way that we are conscious of race and articulating theories of race, it's inherently a modern phenomenon that we experience in society today. When white Europeans discovered the people of color, natives in other parts of the world, what happened was it challenged their existing concepts of the origin stories of human beings as described to them in the Bible. And it raised some disturbing questions for them, right? They did not inherently want to accept that we're all the same family of man, especially because these people looked so different, acted so different, but also because of what they wanted to obtain when they reached these different lands, right? So some pretty serious religious debates emerged in terms of the origins of racial formation, and that was an attempt to reconcile the existence of these very racially distinct people with the origin stories that say we are one species of human beings, right? So what happened was these theories started to emerge which questioned the idea of monogenesis and proposed polygenesis, that there could be more than one species of human beings. And so this history is very much shaped by those in power and their imperial designs, because they wanted to take from these new lands and gain resources and money and power. This necessitated a new way to think about these newly discovered people. They needed to have a way to deny political rights, to accept that they were going to pull from these lands property, to coerce labor of these people, to enslave these people, and even to commit genocide. And in order to do that, there needed to be a shift in ideology from one type of man as described in the Bible to the existence of the other, right? The polygenesis. So these new people that were discovered by Europeans were distinguished as what we call the other, right? And with that, Europeans define themselves as the superior human beings and the real children of God, right? So, as Omi and Winant put it, race and the interpretation of racial differences was a central factor in that worldview. It was necessary in order to justify things like enslavement, genocide, the raping of land and people, right? And the disenfranchisement of people's power and political rights and human rights. Race and racial differences justified all of that. So, one thing that we know is that it's not just something that happened historically and then stopped at a point in time. We tend to think of race as something that's concrete, right? We have this idea that it's stagnant, but it's very much not. Race is continuously changing, and modern scientists, even though modern scientists have abandoned looking for scientific basis for for determining the superiority and inferiority of people based on race, the debates and the attempts to create some validation for that have not completely disappeared. We actually have a pretty long history of both academic and scientific attempts at racial formation, especially in regards to imposing inferior and superior definitions on racial categories. So today, biologists define race as a group of people identified by geographical or linguistic characteristics. They identify approximately 6,000 populations. When you go get your DNA tested and they tell you which racial categories you are, they're actually telling you your populations. We account for approximately 6,000 different populations. Interestingly enough, this definition that biologists give us, a group of people identified by geographic and linguistic characteristics, that's the definition of ethnicity from a sociological perspective. So race as a biological definition, as biologists would define it, is what they call an imprecise term, generally used to refer to groups of people who differ physically or culturally from one's group. So as a biologist would see it, is race is a concept that we use in society to say you're different than me, you look different than me, you are culturally different than me. So there's no biologically real distinctions according to biologists in terms of genetic variation. They say that DNA testing marks only just the tiniest part of populations, and it definitely doesn't mark racial differences. So small fractions of our variation in DNA produce biological distinctions. Most human variability actually occurs within racial groups as opposed to between two groups. So like if you think about people you would consider to be white or Asian or black, there is much more variation within those categories than there is between category A and category B. And the overlap in physical genetic traits is estimated to be over 99.9%. So we are, as human beings, very similar genetically. And another group, the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, the people you know as the census, the way that they actually define race is, and quoted, these classifications should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature. So that's their definition that they give when they give the categories of race. They understand that they're social constructions, which is why we can have political movements, we can have racial formation, we can have racial projects, and why you can propose new racial categories for the OMB. That doesn't mean that within academia, race doesn't have a long history of being constructed along what we would call racist racial projects, right? And through these academic definitions, I posted a picture here. So here's an early set of categories of different racial groups. We have Caucasianoid, Mongoloid, Africanoid, Australianoid, and American, right? So these are the different categories. Categories we kind of recognize today, but not necessarily align with or understand in the same regard that they would, because racial formation is continuously shifting our embedded meaning, right? And a lot of that has to do with those people in power, with political movements, but also within academic spheres and attempted scientific spheres. So if you go back a little bit in history and academia, in the 1700s, Linnaeus and Blumenbach proposed that there were biological or blood differences to race. So this aligns pretty well with those attempts at imperial actions, right? Or justifications for in our attempts for justifications in why it's appropriate to enslave or subordinate other groups. By the time we hit the 19th and 20th century, meaning the 18 and 1900s, we still perceived race as biological, scientific, anthropological, and we were still very much looking at physical traits and subspecies of humans. And we had people like Galton and Gobineau who bring us the ideas of eugenics and ethnology and the presumptions of inferiority and superiority. And what this means is that we embedded into our academic ideology the idea that there were subspecies of human beings, that some human beings, based on their appearance, were superior and some were inferior. Today, we look back on those academic propositions and we actually call this scientific racism. It's because it's perceived as an ideology of racist thought embedded into academia and into science, as opposed to science supporting any real justifications. These theories didn't stand the test of time because there's not evidence to support the theories. In the contrary, there's evidence against these theories within science and academia. But today we still see racial projects that emerge within genetics specifically and educational psychology. We're seeing this again reemerge. So these ideas that there are racial connections or correlations between in regards to ability and our perceived race. The difference, though, is that currently academics are trying to remove the concept of race from the fundamental social, political, and economic determination arguments, right? Instead, they're saying, like, say, intelligence or skill. They're arguing that intelligence or skill lies in some type of innate characteristic that they haven't been able to determine exactly what it is, but that they're saying exists nonetheless. For the most part, though, social scientists reject the biological notions of race, and instead race is regarded as a social construction or a social concept, right? And so we see kind of the history of this with one of our leading sociologists, Max Weber. It's pronounced Weber, even though it's spelled Weber, like Weber. It's Max Weber. And he was one of the first ones to reject the biological explanations of race as an explanation for the reason why we have conflict within society. So in other words, there's conflict between the racial groups because there's a biological difference between the racial groups. He pretty much rejected that, and he said that it was more connected to social and political factors connected to the concepts of race that were the actual instigators for conflict between racial groups. So he said he basically rejects the idea that there's a connection between race and culture, and that there is a and he rejected the concept of higher and lower cultural groups or superior and inferior racial groups, right? So a modern way of thinking about this is you probably have more culturally in common with a person from a different racial group who's from your same city or state. Like if you're from California, you probably are culturally more similar to that person than somebody of your similar racial category from another state or country, or other culture, right? And that's because culture isn't innately linked to our biology. It's linked to our social experiences, the time and the place in which we live. So within contemporary social sciences, race is assumed to be a variable that is shaped by our culture, by the macro level societal forces, by the social structures or institutions, right? It's the systemic social structures that shape our behaviors, our orientation to life, not some innate biological trend that emerges. Omi and Winant essentially are making this argument. Now, they made this argument in the 80s, right? So, what they're saying is there's a formation of race, the racial formation. And to quote them, race is indeed preeminently a concept. Racial categories and the meaning of race is a racial categories and the meaning of race socio-historically are giving concrete expressions by the specific social relations and historical context in which they are embedded. Racial meanings have varied tremendously over time and between different societies. So what do you think Omi and Winant mean by this? They mean race is essentially conceptual. It's a racial social construction, and that categories and meanings of race are continuously changing based on our socio-historical events, right? That these relationships that we have are shaped by our history, our culture, our interactions with other people, and those things embed for us racial meanings. And even though they feel concrete or they feel innate, they vary so much over time and between different societies. We know that they're not concrete or innate. So, what this means is that race is essentially a social construction, which is why we see racial formation. Race is not inherently biologically real, but it's given very real expressions through society and the way we shape and reshape it. Throughout our history and throughout our contemporary society, we're continuing to reshape race and its embedded meanings. People today are shaped by those embedded racial meanings, and those embedded meanings are created throughout history and within their societies. And our perspectives of history and our understanding of how our own society is shaped very much by our current understanding of race. One of the ways that they talk about in the article that it was that we are able to shape people or groups of people into subordinate categories and make something as fluid as ethnicity into something concrete is through what we call hypodescent, or what you might know as the one drop rule. So in the United States specifically, white is seen as a pure category, and any racial intermixture will make you non-white, right? A guy named Marvin Harris calls this hypodescent, and that's any affiliation with a subordinate identity. So to be pure white, you have an affiliation with the superior group, and you avoid all ambiguity or intermediate identity with any other group. The rule of hypodescent was invented in order to keep biological facts from intruding into our collective racist fantasies, right? And we see how this is shaped culturally by some of the examples that are used, right? So in Brazil, where we have a less rigid conception of race, it can allow for intermediate racial categories to the point where parents and children may not consider themselves the same race. Frequently, siblings might not consider themselves the same racial type or racial representation. And in the United States, we would scoff at this. We want to determine externally who you are, which is really interesting because we might actually determine that people who are siblings, even twins in some examples, might be of different racial categories based on external perception of who we perceive somebody is, right? So if you have darker skin versus lighter skin, we have examples of twins. I should have put a few pictures up where one twin, one of their parents is black and one of their parents is white, and one twin comes out looking like actual twins come out looking one black and one white, otherwise identical, but one just, they have the phenotype of the skin color that's different. There's quite a few examples. You should Google it because it's actually really interesting. And so what occurs though is that throughout history, we see that some people have been able to take advantage of this idea of imposing a racial identity on you. If you can look enough white, you can pass as white, although our society would say that according to the one drop rule, you're not, but you might be passing, right? So whereas like in the United States, black is considered to be any variety of social, cultural, political constructions that create your identity within that population, right? But people who would, in that regard, consider themselves black have historically, not everybody, but there are examples that people might actually use the use the attempts to pass as white to skirt discriminatory laws, basically to avoid discrimination and customs by passing as white. So the meaning of race, right, as we define it, continues to be contested. It's going to be contested throughout society, both by individuals on the micro level and groups or organizations, institutions, social structures on the macro level. And we do this through racial projects and through our social structures, which shows us race is inherently a social construction. And according to Omi and Winott, race is used to refer to the process by which social, economic, and racial formation and even political forces determine the content and importance of racial categories, embed them with meaning, and by which they are in turn shaped by racial meanings. You are shaped by racial meanings, your history and its push and shove, even as you shape its history and its meaning and its push and shove. The effectiveness of this, the effectiveness of racial formation as a process in constructing racial meaning and racial identities is very much highlighted for us in the way that we think of race today as natural and common sense, right? We base our perception of somebody based on their sex and their race. Those are the first things we notice about people. We use race in order to provide us with clues about who we think a person is and how they will act, right? We make all kinds of assumptions of people based on their race. We make assumptions about their temperament, their sexuality, their intelligence, their athletic ability, all based on what we perceive their race to be, even if that perception isn't accurate. When people don't fit neatly into one category or another, it causes discomfort for the outside viewer. And that's because we have a whole set of what we call racial etiquette. And racial etiquette is essentially a set of rules, like interpretive codes and racial meanings, which we use to interact with people on a daily basis. It isn't just an adherence to dominant group rules. It's a combination of dominant group rules combined with values and beliefs of subordinate groups. One of the things you hear people say today is, I'm not racist because I'm a minority, right? The problem with that is that according to our social constructions of race and our understanding of racial formation, is that we all are embedded within the racist ideologies of our society. And so many of us, regardless of our race, internalize those ideologies and those understandings. We're using that etiquette. We make assumptions about what race somebody is. On an abstract level, we can say, yeah, there's these racial categories and people fit into them neatly. Go outside next time you're, on campus and sit and just look at people and see how challenging it can really be to identify each person's race. And you'll see how most people's racial categories are quite ambiguous. And even if you think they're not, that doesn't even mean that you're identifying their racial category correctly. And you're not going to be any better or worse at it just because you are part of the dominant group or the subordinate group. And you're not going to be any less socialized into that racial etiquette just because you are of a particular racial group. We all learn some combination or version of the rules of racial classification. And we include our own racial identity within that. If you want to understand how an individual act and see the world in varied situations across their lifetime, understand their ideology. If you want to control how an individual will act and see the world across varied situations over their lifetime, shape their ideology. That is inherently what's happening to us, especially in the realm of social media. Thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.